I'm actually going to start with something which is not civil society, but is just is war, because if you think what are the two most dire situations in the region right now, they're Syria and Yemen, and I think we have to begin with those two just because of how awful it is. In Syria, the epicenter of the danger at this moment is Idlib province in the northwest, where there are some 3 million civilians huddling along the Turkish border, who until very recently were subject to direct bombardment by Russian and Syrian jets. And a combination of pressure put on Putin has succeeded in having a ceasefire that has held for the last 3 months. That was partly pressure from Merkel and Macron, who basically said, we don't want a bloodbath here. And it was also partly, very significantly, Erdogan from Turkey, who has been blocking Syrian refugees for the most part from entering Turkey, but I think recognizes that if there was a bloodbath right across the border, he would have to open up the border, but he would then open up the Aegean as well. And he illustrated that by busing some Syrian refugees from Istanbul and elsewhere to the Greek border and basically saying to Europe, this is what you're going to get unless you stop Putin. And it worked. That plus military pressure that Turkey was applying, and Putin seems to have kind of allowed a degree of military pressure to go forward, because apart from one early incident, Russian bombers have not attacked the Turkish military. So all of this adds up to a kind of precarious situation where the killing for the most part is stopped. There is a ceasefire that is held, but it's very uncertain where it's going to go. And Turkey, in a sense, has assumed de facto control of much of the rebel-held territory in Idlib, but it's just unclear what the long-term perspective, the long-term prospects are for the region. So I think the lesson is ongoing vigilance, ongoing pressure on Putin, because that's the best way to stop the bloodshed. Assad doesn't have the capacity to pursue a military offensive without Russian bombers in the air. Now, the other Syrian issue that is very much at the forefront today is the effort to reopen some of the humanitarian border crossings, both from Turkey and from Iraq, to allow more urgently needed humanitarian aid, particularly medical assistance in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, to reach the people of both northwestern and northeastern Syria. And here, the problem is really Russia, backed by China, with their veto in the UN Security Council. And there is a push for a vote, but Russia is saying, oh, you can just, send the aid through Damascus, completely ignoring the long history of Damascus basically blocking urgently needed medical assistance from getting to opposition-held areas. For the longest time, it was the various sieges. Today, it's Idlib. And so, there's no reason to trust Assad to operate differently, but Putin is saying, oh, it's a responsible government, Syrian sovereignty, that's all you need, which is utterly naive and is callous toward the people who are facing the pandemic. So these are kind of the critical issues facing Idlib. I mean, the other war situation being Yemen, where again, I think there is, guarded reasons for optimism, in that there was so much pressure put on Saudi Arabia for its repeated bombings of markets and mosques and schools, and you have it, a range of civilian structures and people. And there was such horrible press about what Syria was doing to the people of Yemen, bombing and blockading them into the world's worst humanitarian crisis, that finally the cost became too much for some of Syria's critical partners. You saw the United Arab Emirates gradually pulling out of the Saudi-led coalition. You saw Sudan curtailing the number of troops that it was willing to send as the ground force, the people on the front for the Saudi-led coalition. And increasingly, the Saudi military was on its own without much capacity to prevail. And so there has been movement towards some kind of accommodation. The Houthis themselves, the rebel opposition in Yemen, have also had their problems, very much using humanitarian aid as a weapon. And so they also bear a lot of the blame for the starvation and the suffering of the Yemeni civilian population. But all said and done, the primary killers have been the Saudis and their coalition partners. So I think because of the pressure aided by the global outrage over Jamal Khashoggi's murder, coming out a year, has helped to kind of open up a possibility of a better future for Yemen. Now, if you look back, I think in an odd way, speaking of civil society in the region, the autocrats of the region were the biggest beneficiaries of the coronavirus pandemic. Because if you look at the enormous pressure that they were under from the street in places like Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, they were backpedaling, and Algeria, finally got rid of the long-term, nominal leader, but they're trying to change very slowly, incrementally, as little as possible. And the virus obviously made the protests difficult for a while. Now we're seeing, people taking to the streets again, and I think we can anticipate increased pressure now. The bright spot in the region, I think, has been very much Sudan. I visited there in February, and I have to say it was remarkable how this, brutal military dictatorship had to accept the need for change from the popular movement. And I think that there was recognition at a certain point that they just couldn't shoot everybody. They actually tried about a year ago. There was a big demonstration in Khartoum, and the rapid support forces under Hemeti killed a bunch of people, 100 or so people. But that was really kind of the final straw. And at that point, the government recognized, the military recognized that they would have to have some kind of a transition. And it's a real transition in the sense that there are now civilian ministers, and they're very decent people. I met with the prime minister, I met with the justice minister. These are very decent people who are trying to do the right thing for their country. They're trying to establish the rule of law, bring back past perpetrators of atrocities to justice, but they're not really in control. The military is still a very dominant force, and the rapid support forces, the paramilitary force, is perhaps even more powerful than the military. And of course, each is backed by different outside actors. President Sisi of Egypt is backing the military. The Emiratis are backing the RSF, the paramilitaries. And so it's a precarious moment, but it's one where I think Western pressure can make a big difference. There's an economic crisis in Sudan, particularly acutely. There is throughout the region. But, just when I was there were huge lines for bread, huge lines for petrol. And there's a need for Western assistance. So, one of the things I think the West should make clear is that, we're happy to give assistance, but to civilian authorities. We're not going to bolster the military or the paramilitaries as they have in the past. I mean, in the past, Sudan was treated, foremost as a front for fighting terrorism, then as a front for fighting migration. And all of this had the effect of bolstering the military authorities. So a very different approach is now needed by Western governments. I think there's growing recognition of that, that this is a real moment of opportunity for a very different Sudan from what we've known for decades. But it's going to fall apart unless there is economic assistance, because if the Sudanese people don't see real changes, there's going to be disappointment, and you could easily see a kind of a new strong man emerging, somebody like Hemeti, who says, I'm going to be the savior. You don't really need democracy, you just need me. So the stakes are very big, and I hope that the West moves properly. Now, I mean, just circling around the region a bit, obviously the big player is Egypt, and the Sisi government has been utterly brutal in suppressing civil society, in suppressing any independent voice, whether it's the human rights community, dissidents, independent journalists, you name it. And it's, ironically, they hark back to the supposed excesses of the Morsi government, the government that superseded the Mubarak government. But of course, what Sisi is doing now is so much more brutal. than anything that Morsi did, indeed anything that Mubarak ever did. And sadly, again, the West seems to be backing him in the name of stability. Even though if you look at sort of the way Sisi is fighting the insurgency in the northern Sinai, he's fueling that insurgency by the terrible atrocities that his troops are committing, ranging from large-scale destruction of buildings to just summary executions of suspects under the guise of a firefight, when in fact it's nothing of the sort. So it's also a highly corrupt government. It's a government that is putting huge amounts of money into the military, into military-backed businesses. The civilian part of the economy probably is shrinking, given the significant role of the military. And this is a very odd kind of stability. If you look next door at Libya, Egypt as well as the Emiratis are playing a big role in backing General Haftar's forces, even though they have been extraordinarily brutal. And indeed, as with Turkey having entered the scene and really bringing significant victories recently to the officially recognized Tripoli-based government, as Haftar's forces have pulled back, we're seeing mass graves that emerge, mass graves of his victims. And so, here again, Russia has played a critical role. It's a pretty nefarious group of powers behind Haftar. And Sisi in Egypt just recently announced, I have the right to cross into Libya to defend Egypt, which is really, has nothing to do with anything in terms of its defense. It's just an excuse to try to, further back Haftar. But it seems like all these outside players are willing to fight to the last Libya. There are concerns about oil interests. It seems now that Italy may be making a huge sale of arms to Egypt, really for use in Libya. So the outside powers have not played a helpful role. France for many years backed Haftar. They claim now to be neutral, but their neutrality seems to be expressed mainly by criticizing Erdogan for sending in troops to back the Tripoli-based government, rather than really demonstrating the impartiality of a neutral observer. So that is, remains a major source of concern. So anyway, I guess maybe why don't I just conclude with a mention of Israel and Palestine, and then open it up for broader conversation. But we're approaching July 1st, when Netanyahu is threatening to annex the illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And when I say illegal, these are blatant violations of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which says it is illegal to transfer the population of the occupying power to the territory of the occupied population. That's what the settlements are. So the settlements, in essence, are war crimes. One of the reasons why the International Criminal Court is investigating Israeli conduct is because of the war crimes in these settlements. And these are not low-level offenses. These are, the offenders, the people who are ordering these war crimes are at the very top of the Israeli government. They're Netanyahu and his cohorts. So this, the stakes are very large here. And what I think annexation, or the threat of annexation, is bringing to the fore now is recognition that the way that the world has been, conveniently looking at Israel-Palestine is the wrong lens. The lens has been, oh, this is just an occupation. We need, a peace process. And if we can just get the peace process going, everything will be fine. But in fact, for decades now, for over 50 years, Israel's been gradually colonizing the West Bank and using these settlements to take more and more territory. And if Netanyahu goes forth with this annexation, it'll make clear that there's not a peace process. So this is just a fiction. And that we should now increasingly look at what, when I was in Israel and Palestine a few months ago, and what they refer to as the one-state reality. That, that is to say, yes, theoretically we'd like two states, theoretically we'd like a Palestinian state. In fact, there's one state. And so let's stop looking at this as a temporary situation that'll be resolved through negotiations. Let's see it as it is, which is systematic, oppressive discrimination of Palestinian citizens, Palestinian people in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And that's why increasingly you see even the mainstream in Israel talking about apartheid. because the definition of apartheid legally is systematic oppressive discrimination. And it's hard to look at the West Bank, with the fancy settlements here and the impoverished Palestinian village there, and walls between them and separate roads for each. And it is a complete separation. It is a two-tiered legal system with full democratic rights for the Israeli population and very, very curtailed rights for the Palestinian population. So I think it's time to start looking at that reality and saying, why does the world tolerate a state imposing such oppressive discrimination on a population? This is not a temporary thing. This is 50-some years. Let's face it for what it is and put pressure on Israel to stop it. So these are, I could go on, but these are, a few of the areas that I've been concerned about in the immediate region. And I'm happy to kind of open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Ken, for this panoramic view of the situation. Please, for those who are joining through Facebook Live or Zoom, please feel free to ask your question. Actually, we have someone who's raising her hand, Sharmeen. Actually, yeah, I think I have a few questions on my own, but let's start with our participants. Sharmeen, to you.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi, Sharmeen.
Hi, just so that you know who's talking to you. Thank you so much for the introduction. That was very insightful. I was very interested when I learned that someone from Human Rights Watch was coming to talk to us, because I'm really interested in hearing how the other side view things. Obviously, people or nations of this region are. We would like to understand how we view your organizations from a different angle than Western populations do, and obviously getting the truth out there by itself is important and of value. But how would you say the process of your work, organization like yours, like what does it come down to? Like the truth is out there. We know this government is abusing and violating human rights, etc. But we feel like it all comes down to what Western governments are willing to do about it, and not what the international community is willing to do about it. How do you view that? How do you see that? Thank you.
Yeah, Sharmeen, that's a very good question. Let me just begin by saying that, my organization, Human Rights Watch, obviously, we begin by doing very detailed investigations. We have people based throughout the MENA region and around the world. And they, when travel is possible, they go to the site of a potential human rights violation, they investigate it, they talk to the eyewitnesses, they talk to all sides, and we put out as detailed reports as we can about what happened. But that's just the beginning of the process, because we're not there just to publish books. We're there to change, to try to defend human rights. And so we use that factual basis to try to put pressure on governments. In part by shaming them through the media. And we are good at doing that. We get about 1,000 media citations every single day for our work. We have 11 million people following us on social media between Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And so we're able to get the word out, and governments hate that because everybody pretends to respect human rights. We know they don't. And when we show that discrepancy, it's shameful, it's embarrassing. And that's how we can push governments to begin to change. Often they'll attack us and say, we misunderstood, we're biased, we were deceived. And they try kind of public relations techniques to get rid of the stigma. But ultimately they recognize that the bad press is not going to go away until the bad conduct stops. And that's when we can sit down with them and begin a dialogue about what's needed. But we also, and this is maybe the heart of your question, Sharmeen, we also really try to enlist major governments around the world to put pressure on the governments in question. And we do this a lot with the Western governments, but we do it wherever we can with governments elsewhere as well. One very important forum for us is the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. where the West is just a tiny minority of that group. But we regularly get that body to put pressure in various ways on abusive governments, by launching investigations, by condemning, by sometimes even going the next step and going virtually to the, just the precipice of prosecution. And so, for example, we've done this with Yemen now a number of times, where we've been able to get formal investigations launched. We have an initiative now with this next session where our aim is to get governments to put pressure on Saudi Arabia, not simply for what they do in Yemen, but for what they're doing at home. Because the supposedly reformist crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is in fact, locks up anybody who petitions for reform. If you look at the women's rights activists, for example, they seek the right to drive. He locks them up, even though he gives the right to drive, but he wants this to be a matter of, of royal grace rather than popular pressure. He totally doesn't believe in any civil society, any popular role. It's just what he wants to do. That's reform. So there's an effort now to really to spotlight domestic Saudi abuses. And that takes place, there have been, an ongoing commission of inquiry launched by the council with respect to Syria. There's just a reinvigorated fact-finding team for Libya. There are repeated special rapporteurs assigned for Iran. So, this happens regularly, and it's not just the West. So, I wish that there were more governments that were willing to defend human rights in their foreign policy, but there at least are enough of them that we can pretty regularly get a majority on our side at places like the UN Human Rights Council.
Thank you, Ken. We have actually a question from our own Talal Kanaan. Please, Talal.
Thank you, Abdulrahman. Thank you, Ken, for the overview that you provided and for Sharmeen's question. I'm actually very intrigued by the last concluding comment that you made about Palestine. You mentioned a few words and a few ideas that are very contrary to the Western narrative and Western mainstream approach when dealing with the Palestine question. You mentioned the word apartheid, one-state solution, and that is, to be honest, very unusual for us to hear from such a prominent organization like Human Rights Watch. Now it's very encouraging and very hopeful for us to see that this narrative has been adopted by someone like yourself. And I would like to expand a little more about it, maybe. Because there's a general trend, as you see in the region, in the Middle East in particular, authoritarian governments in the post-Arab Spring era, it's been increasing resilience for those systems that have maintained power. They've benefited from the pandemic, as you've mentioned, as civic spaces continues to shrink. So when it comes to Palestine and challenging basically the Israeli policy and the Israeli narrative and the Israeli approach to the occupation, is that a counter trend where really there's a hope basically to mobilize behind a momentum that could challenge and change the status quo in Israel-Palestine? We know about the case of Omar, Human Rights Watch gentleman in Palestine, and how he was expelled from the Palestinian territories due to his covering of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How do you see this really? Are we now at the point of transition in that conflict where we are going towards one-state solution, not only in advocacy, but in realization on the ground? And is it something that we could see in the coming decade or two being realized in a way? That is the first question. I have a second question, perhaps we'll ask it a bit later, about the general trends, maybe globally about the state. And maybe I'll pause here, and if time allows, I'll ask the question a bit later. Over to you, Ken. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I think that there is a real shift in how what Israel is doing in the occupied territories is appreciated in the rest of the world. I think people, naively for far too long thought, as I said, that it's just a matter of negotiation. There is a peace process. Remember Oslo? It's just a matter of pursuing that and everything will work out. And that clearly is not the Israeli plan. You know, the Israeli plan is just to string things along endlessly. You know, the occupation is great for them because it's sort of by definition temporary. And so they can have a temporary situation that goes on forever. I mean, I think that's the Netanyahu plan. Now, people are saying, you know, this is kind of not, it's a naive way of looking at it. And there's growing appreciation, particularly with Netanyahu still as the prime minister, where, you know, this is somebody who nobody has any faith in as a guy who wants peace, you know. And so he is, there is a reassessment about this, you know, what people call the one-state reality. Now, I have to say that, you know, if you look at the Palestinian Authority, they are not giving up on the vision of Palestine. And I remember, you know, speaking with my colleagues in Ramallah. I was there, I guess, a little short of a year ago, and they still very much believe that there, you know, should be and could be a Palestinian state. So they have not adopted the rhetoric of one-state reality. They're still pushing the two-state solution. But I think increasingly people are saying, you know, what are the two states? You know, as you look at sort of the Swiss cheese that's left of the West Bank after you get done with all the settlements and the bypass roads and the security zones, and, you know, what's left? I mean, it's just, you know, a little dot here, a little dot there. You know, you got a few cities connected by tiny little roads. That's not a state, you know, and so people are beginning to say, you know, where's this going? And in the meantime, let's look at how people are living. And you really have people who are living very well in the settlements. And right next door, particularly in so-called Area C of the West Bank, you know, the area that remains under Israeli immediate control. If you're a Palestinian village, you can't even add on a bedroom to your house. You know, they'll say, oh, that wasn't authorized, and they tear it down. And of course, they never give authorization. And the idea is to really try to depopulate these zones, just make life so miserable that Palestinians at least go off to Area A or B, and gradually, you know, increase the land that is solely Israel's. So given that situation, given the very systematic discrimination that is just life in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, is the framework of a peace process the appropriate one? Or should we just look at the reality and say, these are, you know, two peoples living in one land, there's one de facto authority, that de facto authority has a duty to treat people equally. We cannot tolerate this oppressive systematic discrimination. That's got to come to an end. And that's, you know, that is increasingly the call that you're hearing. You know, there obviously are different ways you could do that. I mean, theoretically, Israel could pull back and say, okay, we'll give you your state. But that doesn't seem to be the inclination of Netanyahu at all.
Thank you, Ken. I actually have a question as well. It's about China. Recently, you have been giving a much needed attention, actually, to Chinese violations, including against the Muslim minorities. My question is, how do you think the rise of China economically and politically is going to affect the authoritarian trends in the world, of course, including in the MENA?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. And I think we have to recognize that China is a very nefarious global influence when it comes to human rights. You know, Xi Jinping, the president of China, presents himself as this tough guy, you know, the strong man, but in fact, he is terrified of the Chinese people. And he's doing everything he can to prevent the Chinese people from speaking. And if you look, for example, at his most recent crackdown in Hong Kong, why is he doing that? Because Hong Kong is the one place where Chinese people are free to say what they want. And it's very clear the last thing they want is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. So he is in the process of crushing the essence of Hong Kong, taking away their political freedoms, taking away the rule of law. Now, at the same time, the Chinese government is deliberately trying to sabotage the global system for the defense of human rights. And if you look at what Chinese diplomats do around the world, they use, for example, Xi Jinping's so-called Belt and Road Initiative, this $1 trillion initiative to lend money to people for development projects on the condition that they support China in fighting human rights efforts. And, you know, at the UN, they are constantly trying to corral groups of dictators to back them. And so, you know, even in a place like Syria, where you'd say, you know, why would China ever back Assad as he is, bombing and starving Syrian civilians. Well, they do that because their foremost concern is not to create a precedent of defense of human rights. And so they'd rather have Syrian people slaughtered than to set up a system where human rights are upheld, and that might then boomerang and come back and focus on China. And so that's why really China is, at this stage, not just defending any effort to spotlight its own repression, but it's trying to undermine the entire global human rights system. And I think we all have to be alert to that. Now, it's worth talking about Xinjiang, because here I've got to say, I've been disappointed by the Muslim majority countries of the world. Let's take a step sideways for a moment. And you all remember what happened to the Rohingya Muslims who were ethnically cleansed from Myanmar. And suddenly 700,000 of them found themselves in Bangladesh. There were thousands who had been killed, their homes burned to the ground, women raped, clear crimes against humanity. And the Muslim majority governments of the world, through the auspices of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, to their credit, stepped forward to defend the Rohingya Muslims. And they helped establish, in particular, in essence, a special prosecutor, somebody who's collecting evidence for ultimate prosecution of the authors of these terrible crimes. And this was a very important statement that ultimately was endorsed by the entire OIC. Indeed, Gambia, a tiny member of the OIC, but financed by the Gulf states, brought a genocide case before the International Court of Justice, the so-called World Court in The Hague, and got, in essence, an injunction from them, ordering Myanmar to ensure that those Rohingya who still remain in Myanmar, of which there are, 600,000 or so, that they not face genocide, that steps be taken so that they're not further slaughtered. And so this, shows how when you have a serious human rights problem affecting Muslims, the governments of the region can band together and be very effective. Now let's look at Xinjiang. In Xinjiang, the northwestern region of China, there are approximately 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims who have been detained in so-called re-education camps. And the real purpose of these camps is to force them to abandon Islam, because the Chinese government sees Islam and the Uyghur culture as threats. And so, you would think that this would be outrageous. This is a frontal attack on the Muslim religion. But are the governments of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation saying anything about this? No. Indeed, Pakistan, which has been kind of the leading member of the OIC, has been so bought off by Xi Jinping that they actually applaud what's going on. I mean, they say good things about China. And so we've begun talking to some of the more moderate members of the OIC, governments like Indonesia, Malaysia, Afghanistan, Tunisia, Albania, Gambia, Qatar. There are a range of governments that are thinking about doing something. And I don't think it's going to be possible to get the whole Organization of Islamic Cooperation to speak as one, because there's always going to be the Saudi Arabias or the Pakistans of the world that will not join in. But I hope that we can get a group of governments that will speak out, because what's happening to Muslims, after all, is utterly outrageous. And if the governments of the region are going to close their eyes to this, what do they really represent? They're not even looking after people of their own faith. So, and obviously, a lot of them don't like to take on China because, if you're an autocratic government in the Middle East, you're happy that you got a powerful autocratic government that's sabotaging the human rights system, because that human rights system won't be there to hold accountable the Saudi crown prince or the Emirati crown prince, or, you name the abusive government. But that shouldn't be an excuse for the Uyghurs. And frankly, it shouldn't be an excuse for the people of the region either. So I do see, to come back to your question, China as being a very negative influence in the region, one we've got to be aware of and push back against. And the best place to begin to push back is to come to the defense of the Uyghur Muslims of Xinjiang.
Thank you so much. This is This is a very interesting answer, actually, and very informative one as well. Thank you for that. Okay, I'll go back to Talal for his second question.
Thank you very much, Ken. Actually, this draws well into the title of the session, as the future of human rights and civil society. One would argue that the exact problem that you mentioned in the Muslim majority countries of the OIC, and have basically the inability for those countries to take a stand against China, to voice up objections to the injustices that are happening against the Uyghur minorities, is due to the lack of representative governance. So you don't have thriving civil societies that are represented in governments. You have autocratic governments in most Muslim majority countries, which fail to fulfill or represent the true pulse of the street, as they say. So maybe, are we, in that question of the future of the civil society and human rights, are we going towards basically further authoritarianism, where those huge forces and power dynamics forge alliances, where they continue to suppress the global civil society in large, and in this case, in Muslim majority countries, to continue maintaining those webs of interests, be it in the MENA region, in the GCC, with China, the US, etc. Is this, when we talk about the future of civil society and human rights, and that's not only anything that is induced by the pandemic, but even the future of geopolitics and the transition into a multipolar world where the rise of China is also playing a big role. So are we going towards for darker days for civil society, or are we going, or there's some light by the end of the tunnel? Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you had asked me this question, 6 months ago before the pandemic, I would say that the trend has been in favor of civil society. That if you look at the number of people taking to the streets, I mean, not only in Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, but even for a period in Egypt, when I remember Muhammad Ali's, videos about Sisi's corruption and the outrage that generated. So if you're an autocrat, of course you try to suppress civil society. I mean, rule one for autocrats is prevent people from banding together and prevent them from speaking publicly. You want to have people feeling scared, alone, isolated, helpless, without a significant voice. Then they just accept the status quo, they accept that you're the dictator, and life moves on. That's always the strategy. So, every dictator of the world tries to silence civil society, they try to censor the media, they try to, avoid any indication to their public that there is discontent. Often, even when the internet is censored, even when journalists are locked up, even when dissidents have been suppressed, the final resort is people taking to the streets. And governments try to stop that, but of course there may be a limit to what they're even able to get their security forces to do. And so I think that's where we were a few months ago. The pandemic stood in the way, but it's just a matter of time before the same factors that led people in frustration to take to the streets against these autocracies resume. And in the meantime, fora like this, the use of social media, the ability to sort of get the word out in ways that it's difficult for the government to censor, that emboldens people. It lets them know that they're not alone. It helps them analyze the situation. It helps point the direction for action. So I think what you're doing here is very important with this forum. And I think, all of us should use social media as best we can to try to communicate with others in the region about what's going on, and to try to generate greater attention to the dictatorships, to their oppression, but also to point the direction for change. Because I do think that this is not the future of the region. Dictators, autocrats, they serve themselves. They don't serve the people. That's why autocracy is basically another definition of corruption. I mean, dictators serve themselves. They serve their bank books. They serve their cronies. They don't serve the public, and people see that, which is why ultimately dictatorships topple. And I think what we all should do, those of us who believe in human rights, is to try to spread the word embolden people to insist on their rights, to say that, this man doesn't represent me. I want a government that is answerable to my concerns and that addresses my interests, not its own.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, we have another question actually from Mohammed Zuhaili. Please, Mohammed.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, Ken, nice to meet you here. I am Zuhaili from Singapore. So, of course, it's very nice to hear what you mentioned earlier. So, my thought that I want to raise is that I agree to your statement on dictatorship. However, let's take a look that is another part from the government's sector. However, I take a look about this human rights issue, especially in Singapore, when we know about what happened in Palestine, etc. So, as a normal layman and individual, they decide to how to raise funds to help against all this oppression. And I take a look that certain organizations are actively involved to garner donation, which to be sent as a human rights relief. However, when we take a look and during on the presentation that they say that they are able to raise millions of dollars, but when we take a look at the situation in the media as well as in other sources such as social media, we still could see that that as though that the money that have been raised by the public to save the basic humanitarian refugees is not being reached to them. So I believe that it's not only the government sectors playing the part, it's also as an individual, where we can take a look that some organizations are making use of those conflicts for their own personal pocket money so that they can continue to garner funds, not to help those refugees, not to help those against oppression, but they are just using those money to feed themselves, to pay and to ensure that their organizations continue to run for the daily basis. So I believe, I do not know, but I think as a human's right also we should have this thought and take this into justice, because it's not be fair as a normal person, an individual who have the basic humanity, find pity on those children who with parents who are died, homeless. So we would like to donate $10 or $50 from their own pocket money to help, to lend a hand. However, those organizations are making use of that for their own personal interests. So this is just my point of view and sharing.
I mean, that's a serious allegation. Do you have particular organizations in mind? Because there are many, many reputable organizations out there where they're good investments. They very efficiently convey funds collected from the public, either for advocacy purposes, which is what a group like Human Rights Watch does, or for humanitarian purposes, which there are many good groups like the International Rescue Committee or Mercy Corps that very reliably collect the money and give it to the people in need, and often with great obstacles, often having to secretly pass borders because the government is trying to block them. So I'm not quite sure who you have in mind, but there are plenty of reputable organizations where that's not a problem.
Thank you, Ken. Actually, we have another couple questions actually on the chat. The first question actually is about Turkey. So the question saying, according to Gerald Knows from the European Stability Initiative, it was the first Turkey-EU deal that was the best in terms of saving refugees. And concerning the Syrian border, Human Rights Watch has been very critical about Turkey's refugees policies. Isn't it important to have different perspectives on the Turkish situation, given its strategic importance in the region?
Yeah, I mean, Turkey's treatment of the refugees has been complicated. I think on the one hand, we have to recognize that Turkey has been the most generous government in the region and has accepted, 3.5 million Syrian refugees. Nobody else has come close to that, although on a per capita basis, I suppose Lebanon has a larger percentage. But there have been problems with how Erdogan's government has treated refugees. First of all, nobody else is being let in. So even though, as I mentioned earlier, you've got, Syrian civilians sitting in Idlib at risk of being bombed by Russian and Syrian jets, nobody's let in, or very, very few people are let in. In fact, some people are forcibly sent back. So there's that problem. There's the fact that the Turkish government is really cracking down on the refugees who are still within Turkey, making it more difficult for them to work, more difficult for them to regularize their status. Now, in terms of the deal that basically Erdogan made with Merkel, the Turkish-European Union deal of 2015, part of that was completely unobjectionable. The idea that the European Union should pay, I guess at that point, $6 billion was promised to help, help Turkey care for the refugees. That was perfectly appropriate. Turkey was the frontline state. The costs of caring for refugees should be shared, particularly by wealthier countries like the European ones. What was objectionable was the part of the deal which basically contemplated Greece summarily sending back people to Turkey without really giving them an opportunity to have their asylum claims heard. Now, fortunately, that part of the deal was never really implemented. Greece has continued to try to make life miserable for refugees. And so they've been holding them on these, in these overcrowded camps on the Greek islands, under-equipped. They're very much at risk of the pandemic. And this has all been very deliberate to try to discourage people from taking a boat across the Aegean to Greece. And that has been unconscionable. And it's not just Greece by itself, it's really Greece fronting for the European Union. But at least, with respect to the deal with Turkey, I mean, Turkey has not been, largely has not been expelling people to Syria with some exceptions. But it has not been letting new people in. And it's been making life more and more difficult for the refugees within Turkey. So I think, that's the somewhat complex, mixed reality of life for Syrian refugees in Turkey.
Yeah, thank you. We have also another anonymous question on the fake news, actually, and how Human Rights Watch is dealing with the rise of fake news in the world. Do you see that there is an issue of transparency in the governments of the MENA region due to the lack of, for example, the infrastructure for data collection coupled with the lack of willingness to share data?
Well, I mean, what we are seeing is much more aggressive efforts by certain governments to spread disinformation. Probably the one at the forefront is Saudi Arabia. They've got the money to spend. And I just know from my Twitter feed, there are a lot of Saudi trolls who are utterly ineffective, but they clearly are paid to try to promote Mohammed bin Salman's, supposedly reformist vision and to attack anybody who dares to say anything else. So, yes, that happens. But, those who defend human rights have truth on our side. And truth tends to prevail. So even if governments claim, oh, that's fake news, or they send out their propagandists, or they try to spread disinformation, it doesn't really fool people because it's so easy to see through that. And, whether it's, Mohammed bin Salman's complete shutdown of Saudi civil society and independent voices there, or Sisi's, utter repression of even the kind of handful of freedoms that Mubarak allowed. I mean, you can just go on and on. These kinds of disinformation campaigns are not very sophisticated, and they're pretty easy to push through. So I think, the human rights movement has certain principles. We try to be absolutely as accurate and objective as possible. And because of that, we have credibility. These governments don't have credibility. And people see them as the kind of self-serving propagandists that they are.
Yes, thank you. There is actually a follow-up question on that. Our participant is asking about Human Rights Watch, and have you considered integrating AI and machine learning software to track and monitor such violations regarding fake news and other violations? I
Yeah, I mean, it is, I'm I'm not sure that, I mean, maybe somebody more sophisticated with AI than I am could figure out how to do that. But I'm afraid at this point, we still need human judgment in that. You know, we need people who can really look at something and say, this is false because of the following. We do use technology quite a bit. You know, for example, we use satellite imagery all the time. So even when, for example, the Egyptian government blocks us from going to the northern Sinai, we just use satellite imagery and can watch what's going on. And we actually have an understanding with the company Planet where they will give us images every single day. They literally take a picture of the entire world every day, and we can basically get what we want. So it allows us to follow very closely what's going on the ground. We did this, you know, we've done this in Syria, we've done this in a bunch of places. We also are increasingly using open source analysis, kind of combing social media to take videos and photographs that are found there. You've got to, you know, corroborate them, demonstrate that they're authentic, you know, test them against other sources. But that's another way, you know, a technological way of doing research, even if you can't get on the ground. So we are doing things like that. We haven't yet resorted to AI to just sort of monitor governmental disinformation. We still rely on actual people to do that.
Okay, we have also a couple more questions, but actually I have one that I wanted to pose at the beginning, especially with your note on Israel-Palestine. And actually it's related to the case of your own, Omar Shakir, because it's very obvious that voices for human rights organizations and for human rights in general are getting silenced in many countries. My question is, are we seeing a global trend similar to what happened in Israel, where the judicial authorities participated in the fight against human rights?
Well, we have to recognize that, you know, judiciaries are more or less independent. And so, you know, often they're just an arm of the government. You know, Israel joined a very unsavory group of governments that blocks us. You know, so, you know, yes, the Saudis block us, the Iranians block us, the Egyptians block us. You know, that now Israel's in that group. It's the only, you know, self-described democracy that blocks our investigators. Now, you say, you know, are they silencing him? Omar is not silenced. He's still extremely outspoken. He's, you know, based in Amman now. He is still doing his work very actively. We have other staff in Israel and in Palestine. So this is not stopping us at all. We never let a government block our work. And, you know, I face the same thing. This year in January, once a year, Human Rights Watch issues a global report. We call it our World Report. And this year we wanted to highlight, you know, what we were talking about earlier, the threat that the Chinese government poses to the global human rights system. And so we wrote the report, and I got on a plane and flew to Hong Kong, and we were going to do a press conference in Hong Kong. They blocked me at the airport. That was a really stupid thing for them to do, because it got, you know, massive media attention. It was like a big advertisement for the report. And I just flew back to New York, and 2 days later, we held a press conference at the UN, and it was packed with journalists, and we got huge media attention, much more than we would have gotten if we had just gone ahead with a press conference in Hong Kong. And that's basically the way we operate. You know, if the government blocks us, we redouble our efforts. We're not going to let governments censor our work.
Thank you. We have also another question on India this time. What are your thoughts on India's implementation of the Israeli model of settler colonialism in Kashmir in the middle of a global pandemic, while still keeping the local population under communication restrictions since August 2019?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would really highlight two aspects of what's going on in India. One, as you mentioned, is Kashmir. And the Modi government, you know, used what it thought would be a moment of distraction, the fact that Trump was in the White House and was friendly toward Modi. He used all this as kind of an opportunity to clamp down on Kashmir, to deny it even its sort of, you know, semblance of autonomy that it had been permitted under the Indian Constitution. And then, you know, to prevent Kashmiri civil society from protesting, a lockdown was imposed, including a long internet shutdown. So that remains a big problem. I mean, it's still military rule effectively in Kashmir. But I think we have to look at this as one part of a broader anti-Muslim agenda on the part of Modi and his BJP party. And the most recent manifestation of this was his new citizenship law, which really looks as if it's an opportunity to deny citizenship to the 200 million or so Muslim citizens of India. There was an effort in Assam, a separate Indian state in the northeast, where the government said, oh, all these Muslims, they actually are just immigrants from Bangladesh. They're not really Indian citizens. We're going to make them prove their citizenship. And that was a disaster. It really was, I think it was a million or two people who, suddenly had their identity in question. And what people fear is this new citizenship law is going to be used much more widely to, in essence, force people to prove their citizenship, which is hard to do. If you're a peasant, you don't necessarily have documents. You may not even have a birth certificate. You don't have a passport. How do you prove that you're Indian? You just lived in India all your life, And so you can see how this is, this could be an enormous injustice. It could completely uproot people's lives. But this is, part of what people fear is going on now with this new citizenship law, given the precedent of how things played out in Assam.
Okay, thanks again. We have actually another question that maybe is going to promote a devil's advocate with regards to the role of civil society. So our participant is saying, hi Kenneth, thanks so much for your work and time. In his book, The Myth of Civil Society, Omar Encarnacion talks about how the presence of civil society does not necessarily lead to democratic transitions through the examples of Brazil and Spain. This is because social capital can sometimes be non-communitarian and lead to violence instead of upholding justice. Rather, he proposes instead to measure levels of trust. What are your thoughts on this perspective with respect to the MENA region?
Yeah, look, civil society is not necessarily pro-human rights. Civil society represents the exercise of human rights. But you can have a civil society organization that, wants to promote dictatorships or wants to repress women or wants to, pursue, various restrictive or discriminatory policies. So, the mere fact that you're a civil society organization doesn't necessarily mean that you're good. And you just have to accept that. But I think the real question is, do you want a society that has civil society or not? And there is no question that I want to live in a country that allows civil society. Because the essence of civil society, it's the way that people band together to make themselves heard, to influence their government. And governments have to be responsive to some extent to that expression of public desire. If you have no civil society, you have no way to speak to governments, and governments rule simply for themselves. So civil society is the best antidote there is to dictatorship. It's obviously not just civil society. You need that with the rule of law. You need that with elections. But you need civil society as a critical part of that. And so even though you can have bad civil society organizations, you're still better off with a governmental structure that allows civil society.
I see. Okay. Actually, we will just have two more questions before we conclude this session. And this one from Rawan Hamoud, she's asking, with the international institutions and their liberal tools being undermined in the current global order, especially by the current US administration, how do you think human rights movement could go forward? Sorry, you are muted, Ken.
Okay. I'm not sure I heard that question entirely, but I think the question is how given the Trump administration, what's the way forward? Is that?
Yes, especially the current US administration.
Yeah, okay, because I think we have to recognize that Trump is attacking almost every global institution. This is the guy who just has an America first philosophy. Whatever his narrow vision of America's interests are, that's all he cares about. And so, he withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council because it criticized Israel. He's withdrawn from the World Health Organization because he needed a scapegoat for why he mishandled the pandemic so horribly. So he says, oh, it's the WHO's fault. You know, it was too close to China. When in fact, you know, all the information he ever needed to act to protect Americans from the pandemic, it was all in the public domain. He just ignored it. He wanted to, you know, keep the economy revving because he thought that that would be better for his reelection prospects. So he has himself to blame, but he's scapegoating WHO. Most recently, he has now imposed sanctions on the staff of the International Criminal Court because it had the audacity to want to investigate American war criminals, really the torturers for the CIA in Afghanistan, and Israeli war criminals on Palestinian territory. The ICC is doing this completely within its powers. It has total jurisdiction to do this, but Trump is basically saying, who cares about the rule of law? I'm just going to, you know, use America's economic might to undermine this global institution, which is there to provide justice for war criminals. He's going to try to destroy it because American or Israeli war criminals might be implicated. So that's the kind of guy Trump is, utterly unprincipled. And I think the, you know, you've got Trump on one hand, you've got China on the other, which is also trying to undermine the global human rights system. And so this could be a disastrous moment. But the good news is that we've seen many governments recognize that they can't take the defense of human rights for granted. They can't rely on the United States in this era. And they have to band together, build coalitions, and defend human rights themselves. And so we're seeing that happen over and over. You see a group of Latin American democracies under the banner of the Lima Group coming to defend the rights of Venezuelans. I talked about how the Organization Islamic Cooperation came to the defense of the Rohingya Muslims. You've got various constituencies of smaller European states fighting in Saudi Arabia or in Yemen. So there are things that can be done. It takes others recognizing that human rights are important and they've got to play their role. They can't depend on the United States.
I'd like actually to conclude this session by not a question, but an advice from you. We'd like to hear your advice to the youth, especially in the Muslim majority countries and in the Middle East, and of course beyond that, who are active in civil society and working towards change with this route ahead not clear at all. What would be your advice to them?
Right. Well, I mean, my advice basically is don't accept the status quo. You know, recognize that your government wants to silence you. That's the best way to stay in power. And today, because of social media, we all can band together, we all can speak out, we all can organize. And that's what you need to do to change things. So, you know, recognize that the people have enormous power in their hands. The government is doing what it can to keep us divided and silenced. But we should redouble our efforts to recognize that this kind of autocratic rule is wrong, that everybody deserves human rights and democracy, and you can act on that as best you can. Start with social media, find ways to organize, find ways to be active, to stay informed. That's how we'll make a better world.